We're all good. Okay. So why don't we do a very quick round of introductions? This will be a one-time thing, so everybody, all the students will know who we are, and then I'll let you introduce the first group. So again, I'm David Durfee. I live in Shaftesbury, which is down in Bennington County, and I represent Shaftesbury and Sunderland and Glastonbury. I'm chairing the committee, and the vice chair is Representative Supernath.
Hi, I represent the towns of Windsor, Windsor 4, Barnard, Concord, Bridgewater, West Hartford.
Hi, John O'Brien. I represent Windsor Orange 1. That's Royalton in my hometown.
Michelle Boslin, I represent Wyndham 3, which is Westminster, Rockingham, and Brookline in northern Wyndham County.
Richard Nelson, Orleans 1, which is the town of Derby, class of 85.
Animal science.
Animal science, AGR.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille 1 District, Stowe.
I'm Leland Morgan. I represent all of Grand Isle County and a portion of the town of Milton. I'm class of 1975.
Great. Well, thank you, Chair Durfee. I thought I'd just set the stage a little bit for what we're doing here. So it's nice to see you all again. I was here in January to give testimony on food insecurity. So thank you for having us back. I brought today 18 students from the University of Vermont's Food Systems Graduate Program. So these are all master's and PhD students in food systems at the University of Vermont, our best, our brightest. They're all first and second year students in the program. And I've been doing this for a while in my connection with the committee. So I teach food policy at the University of Vermont. We cover everything from agriculture to nutrition policy. It's a required course for the students. And when Representative Partridge was chairwoman, we brought the students to the State House for several years, and the students got to see the process. But this is the first time we've done a bit of a deeper dive, and I'm really excited about that. And Chair Durfee and I had a couple of conversations sort of right when the session was starting, and we talked about some topics that might be of interest to the committee that were really sort of salient issues of the moment. And so what the students have been working on for their presentations that you'll see today are semester-long projects really focused on 4 key issues that Vermont is grappling with at the moment. And so we recognize that some of the issues we're going to talk about today are in varying stages of the legislative process. So for example, universal school meals, we know has passed out of this committee unanimously, is on, in the budget process right now. So some of these topics have not made crossover or are just such big topics like affordable housing and agricultural land development that we hope that the students' work will help inform varying levels of debate, whether they're in this committee this year, next year, on the House floor, with the governor, et cetera. So I think the students will provide some nice context for all of those issues. And so they have a presentation, it's 12 to 15 minutes, and they also have a brief that they've put together that's a bit of a deeper dive, well-cited, of information for you in there if you want to dig deeper. And the 3 things that the students were asked to do on all 4 of these topics was, first of all, to understand the benefits of the program or the issue at hand. The second was the costs and the challenges of the issue. And the third was to really look at what other states and jurisdictions are doing on this topic as sort of a policy analysis. So recognizing that you're a citizen legislature and probably don't have a ton of time to do this kind of deep dive policy work, we hope that this is a nice service and partnership with the committee and that it helps provide a little more information for all of you. The 4 topics. So the first is looking at PFAS contamination and sewage sludge, in particular, some of the ag application issues, but also the alternatives that are available and what other states are doing. The second topic this morning will be the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters program and what that looks like and what other states do that are similar. Then we'll hear from the students who have dug into the very complex topic of affordable housing, agricultural land development, taxes, those issues, and then finally the Universal School Meals program here in Vermont. So I think that's all I have. Any other questions before we get started? Great.
Thank you.
I will turn it over to the group that is focused on PFAS contamination.
Before we get started, Chairman, there's a lot of presentation where we always love and enjoy engaging with witnesses or presenters. But with this many, we can spend a half an hour on one.
I know.
So do you request that we listen and ask questions at the end of each segment or at the end of,
Well, yes, so let's let
just so we
the,
don't stumble along here?
yeah, we'll hold our questions until the presentation is over, and that will be, they'll signal us when the presentation is over.
And this is, in this case, when the PFAS.
Yeah, so we'll do that 4 times, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to the students. And maybe you just want to briefly introduce yourselves as well.
Chad, you and I have the pleasure.
Don't want to sit or stand
There's some extra folding chairs there.
Yeah.
To sit.
As chairs,
We already decided they were going to stand. Yeah.
Alright, someone else is coming in the door.
they may.
They may or may
Do you want to
You'll
invite
hear
someone else?
With a tiny bit of warning.
There's a window so they can see. And
Yeah.
hopefully won't open it. Usually press. the-
Yeah, you can just advance it. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for having us here today. We're all very excited to talk to you about the topics that we researched, and we really appreciate you taking the time to hear our presentations. Our group is here to talk to you today about PFAS contamination in sewage sludge, and we'll review disposal options, costs, and benefits for the state of Vermont. Before we get started, my name is Megan Knight, and I'm a master's student at the University of Washington, or University of Vermont. That's how nervous I am.
My name is Bridget Craig. I'm Sadie Southall.
CJ Sands.
Yay. Okay, so our issue today is about PFAS and sewage sludge. There are thousands of different PFAS, and they are synthetic chemicals that are found in consumer products, and they're used in industrial processes and technologies. And they break down really slowly in natural environments, so they accumulate in things like soil and water. They're also found in our sewage sludge and wastewater treatment facilities. And because they're so difficult to remove, it means that disposing of that waste can further contaminate other environments. So when biosolids or sewage sludge are applied to land, the PFAS can leach into groundwater and accumulate in agricultural products. Exposure to PFAS is a risk to human health and environmental health, and high levels of exposure have been associated with things like increased risk of cancer for humans. However, we don't know the long-term effects of PFAS from land-applied sewage on human health, or the extent to which they actually accumulate in crops grown on that soil, and how to even assess or quantify the level of risk from exposure to different sources of PFAS. So they've been an issue in Vermont for a while now. This is a brief timeline about PFAS in Vermont and the management of sewage sludge. So about a decade ago, Vermont was talking about different ways to dispose of sewage sludge, which, by the way, the options then are pretty much the same as they are now a decade later. And then the focus was kind of on PFAS in groundwater. And then more recently, in 2024, the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation issued the interim strategy for mitigating PFAS risks associated with management of residuals, including biosolids. And then in 2025, Bill 292 was introduced, and that proposed to completely ban the land application of sewage sludge. There's also Bill 238, which has already passed in the House and is now in the Senate. And that proposes to phase out consumer products that contain PFAS, kind of as a way to address PFAS at the source. And doing that can really impact how much PFAS actually end up in the sewage sludge later on. So there are 3 well-established ways to dispose of sewage sludge in the United States. These are land application, landfilling, and incineration. There are other options that are emerging to dispose of it and treat it to eliminate the PFAS, but they aren't widely available or affordable yet. You can see that in 2023, 60% of biosolids in the United States were applied to land. Most of this was agriculture, but it also includes things like
golf courses and other land.
Before we review each disposal option in detail, that's good. We wanted to provide some context about how Vermont currently disposes of its biosolid waste. The state of Vermont regulates two classes of biosolids, Class B and exceptional quality or EQ. The difference being that exceptional quality biosolids are treated to a higher standard and can be sold commercially. In this table of data from 2022, you can see that land application is the primary way that we dispose of our sewage, sludge, and biosolid waste here in Vermont, with over 70% being applied to land and 30% being applied to land in our state. Every option has its trade-offs, and so we're going to talk about the costs and benefits of those different options. Oh, and sorry, before I move on, the graph on the right shows you that of the biosolid waste that's applied to land in our state, the vast majority is applied to agricultural waste. So we'll begin with land application. Land application is a common disposal method because it tends to be less costly, produces less carbon emissions, and provides a benefit as a soil amendment on agricultural and non-agricultural land alike. Biosolids can also be a more affordable substitute for chemical fertilizers, and many Vermont municipalities have already invested in biosolids processing infrastructure. Land application can be regulated based on the concentration of PFAS in the biosolid waste, and we'll talk more about regulation in detail shortly. There are a number of challenges with land application. With any land application, there will still be a risk of PFAS contamination. The EP estimates that even low levels of PFAS in biosolid waste can pose a risk to human health. This risk, however, is highly variable and based on site-specific factors like the crop type and the proximity to water sources. Risks to human health are generally lower for certain crops like grain, fuel, and fiber crops, and generally higher for contaminated water sources and agricultural products like beef, milk, eggs, and fish. These are still emerging areas of research, which makes it difficult to accurately assess the risk to human health posed by land application. Additionally, another challenge is that regulation may require rigorous monitoring and testing, which does incur administrative and laboratory costs. So, what are other states doing? The lack of federal regulation on PFAS and biosolid has led to a patchwork of different state regulations across the country. Maine and Connecticut have already banned the sale and use of biosolids from wastewater, and Oklahoma and Mississippi have introduced but not yet passed similar legislation. Texas has introduced legislation to limit PFAS in biosolids specifically for agricultural applications, and a variety of other states, Colorado, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Wyoming, and Vermont, have instituted a tiered approach to regulate biosolids applied to land based on the amount of PFAS. So we won't go into detail into this table, though it is in the brief, but at a glance, you can see that each of these states is taking a slightly different approach to the tier system and how it regulates land application. Some of these states, including Vermont, have adopted interim guidance while they continue to investigate the issue and eventually develop regulations, more permanent regulations.
So our next option is landfilling. As Megan just explained to us, Vermont landfill is about 22% of our sewage sludge in state, and then we send about 5% out of state to be landfilled. There's some benefits to landfilling, including that it can contain the PFAS contamination if proper systems are implemented, proper lining to the landfill itself. It's also an established process with regulation and systems in place to actually get the sludge where it needs to go. So one of those benefits is that we wouldn't have to put too much more investment into expanding that system. Sorry, one second. It does cost more than land application, but it costs less than incineration. And it does not have that benefit of the nutrient recycling that you get from land application. We also know that the capacity can be increased in the state. So there is some wiggle room here for expanding our landfilling options in Vermont. It does come with challenges, though. There are still risks of contamination from leachate and spills. And we also have a very limited capacity in the state for landfilling. We've got, as you all know, I'm sure, one landfill in the state with about 20 years capacity left. So we'll get into future research later, but we would need to seriously consider expanding our landfill capacity if we were going to continue down this route and expand the amount of sludge that we landfill. And we also know that there's methane gas produced from sludge that's landfilled, which is of course another environmental and health safety concern to be considered. So what are other states doing? In this table, we show a breakdown of states that have moved from land application to landfill disposal of their sludge. And as you can see here, there's almost a 100% increase in the amount of money that those states spend on that landfilling or on that management if they are landfilling. So we know that landfilling can be either like a additional management strategy or a temporary solution. But it just seems like there are some barriers in place that would not make it a great option for like total sludge management in the state.
So incineration does have its risks, even when it's properly monitored. But there is an infrastructure in place within the region to be able to break down PFAS. Breaking down the PFAS reduces the direct source pollution into our air, our water, and in our soil. And the fact that there is an infrastructure in place that is scalable means that we can implement solutions to PFAS incineration quicker than we can other solutions. And this relieves the burden on the landfill, which was just mentioned, that isn't suited for PFAS disposal, and it reduces the amount of the concentration of PFAS within those landfills. With that being said, the actual process of incineration has a cost to it. Incineration requires that the PFAS gets burned at a certain period of time, and then that certain period of time has a price tag that is higher than the other PFAS applications. In this current iteration that we have for incineration, we don't have rigorous oversight of if PFAS is being burned correctly, and if it's not burned correctly, that does produce additional risks into the environment. And Vermont lacks the current facilities to incinerate PFAS. So any PFAS that does get incinerated from Vermont would have to be transported out of state, which also introduces risk as far as spills and contamination. And this is a snapshot of what other states are doing, particularly within New York and New England region, but nationwide, 14% of biosolids are incinerated. Costs vary based off location of where this incineration takes place and the capabilities of the region to be able to incinerate said PFAS.
So we've broken future research down into 3 general categories. First of all, we propose some sort of cost benefit analysis to investigate the actual cost and the risks that we've mentioned of expanding some of these options and considering like the short and long-term disposal plans for the state of Vermont. We also think that there needs to be some more research into the long-term health effects and environmental effects of PFAS within the state of Vermont. We know a lot about chronic contamination with PFAS, but there's less known about sort of the everyday, which I guess could also be chronic. But like if you're not living next to a PFAS, processing facility somewhere where there's tons of PFAS concentration, what would those future scenarios look like? What is the risk there? Also, in terms of risk assessment, obviously land application of sludge is really important to the agricultural systems in the state. So what would it look like if farmers did not have that option in their ag systems? And then finally, there's some new technologies that we get more deeply into in the brief, but the EPA is working on a bunch of new cutting edge technologies for sludge, both disposal and treatment. So today we presented you with the three most common options for sludge management and disposal. Land application, as we know, has some really great systems benefits that you are recycling those nutrients with, of course, that huge trade-off of the risks of PFAS. And it's cost effective and already widely used in the state. Landfilling is the next most affordable option, but as we discussed, it's got some trade-offs. And incineration is costly, and there's some potential in the state, but it's not something the state's doing now. More research is needed to understand the long-term health effects of PFAS and what some disposal options would look like in the state going into the future. As Sadie mentioned, of course, there's that the House Bill 238, I get the number switched, to ban the use of PFAS in consumer products, so starting at the source.
That is our presentation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for listening to us.
Don't go anywhere. Yeah. Yeah, questions from the committee.
So many.
Let's start with one and then Representative Nelson.
All right. By the way, when you showed the picture of the landfill in Coventry, if you look right over the top, you can see my house. I'm 1.7 miles from it.
Wish we could say that was on purpose.
Land application important to the farmers of the state. I don't currently know of any farmers that are applying sludge to their land. There's very little in the state, although I understand some of it is exported and then turned into a compost material and sent back. I guess my question for you, would you put it on your garden and eat the vegetables yourself, knowing you're risking contamination? I will not put it on my land and feed it to my cows. Absolutely not. So I'm just asking you, would you put it on your garden and eat those vegetables?
That's a great question. That question gets to the heart of something that we mentioned, which is the risks to human health are not well understood. So we do know that PFAS are already prevalent in our environment, whether from the food sources, from the clothing we wear, from the products we use in our homes, but it's not well understood how those different sources compound into like a total concentration that you receive as a person or what that means for your health. So not to give you a non-answer, but what I would say is it matters what the PFAS concentration was in that material. So as you saw on the table, something that Vermont has set quite a low standard for, and the interim guidance actually says, if you're going to apply PFAS contaminated biosolids over that threshold, you have to test your soil first to ensure that the soil is under the threshold, and then you can apply. But if the soil already meets the PFAS contamination threshold, you can't apply anymore. So that's the kind of consideration I would make if I was looking at my garden and have the ability to test. I would probably try to follow the interim guidance that Vermont has set to the best of my ability. But it really depends on what crops you're growing, how much you're applying, how much PFAS is in the material you're applying, and what your personal assessment of the risk itself is. I hope that helps answer your question.
Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. I'm not being a devil's advocate because everything you all presented rings true to us. But we're tasked with protecting public. We're tasked with coming up with thoughtful policies. And you mentioned the first bill in the list of your two bills that advocated for zero land application. I've twice visited wastewater plants, spent hours, and there's wet tons, which there's a fair amount of, but there's actual biosolids at the end that are stored, and most municipalities in the Vermont had an option to export them to Sherbrooke, Quebec. That relationship has broken down and we are running out of options. The one licensed plant that is line as containment that is trying to, through the the lower the seepage at the bottom that's piped and stored. And they are talking about, and they're only taking biosolids from certain plants, including the one here in Montpelier. And one of the engineers, and I met with other engineers, said a containment option must exist, or we're going to be in violation. Virtually every sewage plant, and by the way, we're a rural state, so a lot of these biosolids come from pumping of individual septic tanks, and they have very high concentrations of PFAS, is plural. And their only option now is to bring them to certain plants, including and they pay real money, but they discharge into, let's say, the Montpelier system. And eventually those biosolids might, through a contract, be trucked to Coventry. Their request was, while these new technologies are being developed, we need an option for storage and containment and a blanket, and it might be in a abandoned landfill that could be lined in some form, create some storage there. Another option they talked about was on highway mediums, in place in the interstate or aprons of airports. They're not used for agriculture. The community I spoke to is 100% against land application in agricultural situations. Wastewater is one issue, but our drinking water has them. Most municipal water sources have them. So 3 parts per trillion is okay, but 5 is not. What's 20 parts per trillion? It's a giant problem that we have solving. You showed that incineration plant that looked more like the former Vermont Yankee nuclear plant that was shut down. The point is, the state of Vermont needs a temporary storage option. Is that considered land application if it's brought, stored and contained in a lined gravel pit?
That would go under, to my understanding, the umbrella of land billing, or maybe even just under its own umbrella. And we get into that in the future research a little bit, considering both the short and long-term options for the state. We did not get into the exact extent that you brought up, but that certainly goes into that cost benefit and risk analysis that we discussed. So, we've got to consider specifically what would this look like just in pure numbers and practicality, where would it go in the state? And that's something, that's not information that we have, but it's information we're saying like this needs to be better understood.
And the last follow-up that was recommended was to have regional containment districts for everyone from Windham County and Brattleboro or Bennington to ship up to Coventry, even if they had the capacity. And there are risks there that there might be several sewage districts, 5, 8, 10 around the state to handle it. So I'll leave it at that.
I think if I can build on Bridget's answer a little bit, I mean, you're absolutely right. If we didn't apply any of it to land, it has to go somewhere. That's one of the cruxes of the problem. So in terms of landfilling, just to clarify, so some of it can go into a municipal landfill like Coventry that also accepts other kinds of waste. There are sewage sludge or biosolid monofills, which means a containment site that is exclusively accepting sewage sludge, which sounds like what you're describing. As Bridget mentioned in her presentation, there is a risk for further environmental contamination if those monofills are not properly lined and contained, and they do generate leachate. Leachate, whether from a municipal landfill or from a monofill, does have to be taken away and then treated at a wastewater treatment plant, and then becomes further biosolid waste. And you can see how we have a bit of a cyclical problem on our hands. But all that being said, to get at the heart of your question is that the most immediate solution for Vermont, besides the Coventry landfill, is to export that waste. And as you saw from the table on one of the slides, we are already exporting quite a bit of waste, whether that's for land application in another state or for landfilling in another state. Like there are neighboring states like New Hampshire that have quite a bit of higher capacity of landfill than we do, but municipalities will have to pay for the transportation, the tipping fees, all of that. So it comes down to a cost analysis almost at the municipal level of investing in additional infrastructure in the long term versus the short term disposal options. So we try to capture as much of that complexity as we could in the space we're allotted, but it is a very complex issue, like specific to each locality.
You've done an excellent job
Yeah,
of,
I agree.
in the small space you were allotted, capturing a great deal of information. We do have time for one more question.
It's okay. I'm good.
Okay, all right.
One thing I wanted, I'm just somewhat ignorant on how this PFAS is getting into either our private septic or public, you know. I mean, we know like North Bennington, it was because of processing, but is it universally around the state? Is it an excrement that things we're eating? Is it when we wash our clothes? All, you know, tell me just how it's getting into water.
That's a great question. We can give you the answer to the best of our knowledge, but I'll just give it an asterisk, which is that there's still a lot of research on the sources. So in terms of domestic household products, everything from the like water that you wash your clothes in, a lot of rainwear, for example, Gore-Tex rainwear is a source of PFAS. Household products like personal care products, shampoos, body washes, conditioners can contain PFAS. Household cleaning products, floor finishes, if you can imagine mopping your floors, you then throw that wastewater down the bathtub drain, it goes into your septic system. Those are some domestic sources. I have not seen anything in our research that pointed to the food waste or like human waste, you know, being a particular source, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was also one. But by far and away across the country, the major sources of PFAS contamination, as I think Sadie mentioned, are industrial sources. So paper mills, chemical processing, manufacturing plants.
Okay, so, you know, not just for you to maybe look into more is, I was wondering how much then in a wastewater treatment facility, once it's in the water, how much is essentially being filtered out that ends up in sludge, how much continues on in the water that's treated and just goes into Lake Champlain or wherever the bat and kill, you name it. And then when you think of Vermont, what did we hear? We have 75% private sewers or something in the state. So that, you know, it's a lot, like Jed's saying, you know, just getting into our septic tank out the back on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That would be right at the limits of what I can confidently speak to from our research. My brief understanding is that the sewage sludge, so that's the solid material, or the biosolids, sorry, the solid material left over, the water content is taken out. And I can't say for certain, but I think the sort of reverse osmosis water filtration process can remove some of the PFAS. And so the majority of them do end up in the biosolid base. Okay. And I will preface that with, I would want to verify that information for you, but yeah, I don't know if any of my teammates has. Yeah, I think you covered it. Yeah.
I've taken notes on the questions, Representative O'Brien, so we can have the students follow up with the committee as well.
Absolutely.
Well, I thank you for being well prepared. We could, as is often the case, have an ongoing conversation well into lunchtime. We have 3 others that we want to hear from, though. So thank you. And let's move right on.
Okay, our next group is going to be focused on the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters program, which is, I know, something that you all have heard some testimony on before, but the students will bring some new ideas to light and also some understanding of what other states are doing as well. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the presentation today. We're excited to be here. Our group will be presenting on Vermonters Feeding Vermonters. My name is Amanda Hudson.
I'm Rochelle Cookie.
And Ellen Coffey.
I'm Emily Grabowski.
So yeah, as Meredith mentioned, we want to acknowledge that we are aware that this bill has already passed the House and is currently being reviewed in the Senate. So you all are likely well versed on the program, but we hope that the information that we present to you today will support you with conversations with other legislators. We also will be presenting information on similar programs in other states. So we hope that these comparisons could possibly inform a funding solution for this program. So Vermonters Feeding Vermonters is a Vermont food bank program with goals to reduce food insecurity, provide financial security to Vermont farmers, contribute to the Vermont economy, and decrease the state's environmental footprint. Bill H-167 seeks to establish permanent funding for the program. So they are asking for ongoing annual appropriations from the Agency of Agriculture to the program. Since the program started in 2018, they have expanded to 299 participating farms. They purchased 104 different types of crops, and they have contributed an estimated $3.8 million to the Vermont economy. The program operates through 3 different components. The first one is the large-scale wholesale purchasing, which is when the Vermont Food Bank buys directly from large farms throughout the state. The second component is the mini grant to network partners, and these network partners are throughout the state, and they use the mini grants to purchase from local, small-scale, diversified farms and distribute food to their community. And then the last component is the culturally responsive farm share CSAs, and most of these are distributed to new American families and migrant farm workers.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm going to share some of the key benefits that we kind of glean from some reporting. There's certainly a lack of kind of widespread reporting and data on this program. Much of it comes from the food bank itself. So these are coming from surveys that were conducted through the food bank and through our conversation with Michelle Wallace. And so on a first note from Vermont farmers, this came from the 2025 survey. Of the wholesale partners, there was 24 respondents of the 299, but kind of past surveys and Michelle both kind of echoed similar sentiments. So farmers were reporting that the program gave them kind of a stable and kind of guarantee in a very ever-changing market. They said that these early season contracts were guaranteed for fair market prices. And on a kind of more cultural and social note, they expressed that this program, it aligned with their values of wanting to feed and kind of nourish their local communities and their neighbors instead of growing crops that were being shipped to faraway states. And from a consumer point of view, kind of some of the surveys from many grant partners expressed that clients were sharing that this program gave them access to nutritionally dense foods that were culturally responsive and obviously affordable. In terms of environment and the economy, as Amanda alluded to, this kind of keeps part of the supply chain local, reducing food miles and emissions. And speaking to the economy, the UVM Center for Rural Studies has found that every dollar spent on locally produced food contributes an additional 60 cents to Vermont.
Thank you, Bella. So according to a spokesperson for the Vermont Food Bank, one of the most consistent challenges has been limited and unstable funding. While existing participants have the capacity to grow more food for the food bank to purchase, the program has not always had the resources to do so. This limits the quantity and diversity of produce available for distribution, even as demand remains high across communities. Smaller farms face particular barriers to entry. Many lack the scale to meet the wholesale quantity requirements and price their products typically closer to retail value, creating a price barrier for the food bank to purchase them. The mini grants have helped to cover these price barriers. However, the crop diversity is still limited, especially in between the months of April to June, when Vermont's growing season provides fewer fresh produce options. And the future availability of mini grant support has varied from year to year. Reduced budgeting may restrict the number of small-scale farms that the program can feasibly partner with. Logistical complexity is another issue. Coordinating with multiple farms to meet order minimums, often a full pallet of single crop, requires significant efforts.
While larger farms and wholesalers can help meet that demand, the limited number of large-scale farms across Vermont is limited. Additionally, coordinating packaging standards, delivery schedules, and invoicing with multiple farmers adds further complexity. Transportation continues to be an issue. A lot of farmers do not have their own temperature regulated transportation and often rely on third-party vendors. Farmers who are able to deliver their product tend to participate more frequently, which leads to possible market inequity opportunities. On the receiving end, many community partners for the mini grants operate with limited staff, including many who are volunteers, and this comes with its own challenges, including limited infrastructure, operational limitations, and reduced availability overall. External factors such as extreme weather events, including flooding, drought, and late frosts, also disrupt these supply chains. And when crops are lost or delayed, the program must often source this food from elsewhere. And this requires additional coordination and additional financial resources. Understanding and addressing these interconnected challenges will support the long-term sustainability of the program and its ability to continue serving both farmers and communities.
Thank you, Emily. So we took a look at similar programs across the country to help us kind of contextualize Vermonters Feeding Vermonters. First of all, Vermonters Feeding Vermonters was based off of an existing program out of Maine called Mainers Feed Mainers. And the crucial difference between the two programs is that Mainers Feeding Mainers runs all administrative duties through their Maine food bank, which is the Good Shepherd Food Bank of Maine. So when Vermonters Feeding Vermonters adapted the program, they wanted to take that administrative burden off of one food bank, and they did that by establishing the mini grant model, which we talked about earlier. And that also allows community partners to make decisions for their direct communities, keeping things hyper-local, things like that. Another similar program is called Hope's Harvest, and that one is run out of Rhode Island through a food hub called Farm Fresh Rhode Island. Hope's Harvest does incorporate gleaning into their model. And they also pay producers directly through a farm to food pantry program, which is similar again to the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters mini grant program in that they disseminate funding to their partner organizations and allow those partner organizations to make their own purchases. But a crucial difference with that program is that Farm Fresh Rhode Island created an online platform called Market Mobile, where producers can independently sign on and list their own products at their own prices. So then community partners log on and spend those funds through Market Mobile. And that is actually a new model as of 2025. Previously, Hope's Harvest was doing forward contracting, similar to Vermonters Feeding Vermonters. But Hope's Harvest, which I'll get to shortly, is run largely through USDA funding. And when that was recently lost, they decided to pivot to this model, which again takes a bit of the administrative burden off of their food bank and allows farmers to take on that responsibility themselves. Hope's Harvest also services low-income seniors across Rhode Island. They have a fresh food box that they distribute, or seniors are able to choose an equivalent value electronic benefits card, which they can then use exclusively at partnering farms to get the equivalent value of the fresh food they're choosing. And lastly, we looked at a program out of New Mexico called the Regional Farm to Food Bank Program, which purchases food from local farmers and ranchers and distributes it to food banks and partner organizations across the state. So similar to Mainers Feeding Mainers, New Mexico runs all of the administrative duties through one food bank, which in that case is a major food bank known as the Food Depot. And they lead purchasing and they work closely with their community sites to select culturally relevant foods for those communities. And while the Regional Farm to Food Banks program in New Mexico does require producers to handle their own transportation, New Mexico is a pretty small scale farming state, so that's normally pretty doable for them at that scale. They do not formally forward contract with producers, but they do establish agreements at the beginning of each season that allows farmers to plan and allows them flexibility for weather events or unforeseen surpluses. Yeah, so here's a table we created just showing population served, farm partners work with, and the annual budgets that these programs are working with. So in terms of that funding, Mainers Feeding Mainers receives a permanent allocation of $1 million from the Maine Department of Agriculture budget, and that is renewed each year. Then they source an additional $1 million from individual donors and grants. However, currently they are seeking to get an additional $1 million from the Department of Agriculture, which would bring their total funding to about $3 million per year. And that would allow them to expand purchasing, take on additional farm partners, and it would also relieve some of that administrative burden for them to have to seek that supplemental funding each year. Hope's Harvest from Rhode Island is funded 22% private funding and then 78% public USDA funding. 83% of that is local food purchasing agreement funds. So they are in a little bit of a funding flux right now with those programs being cut, which is why they're adapting certain programs to take that burden off of their administration. And then New Mexico's program is run entirely through USDA local food purchase assistance funds. So that program will no longer be funded as of June 30th. And then lastly, we know how these programs are funded. But we wanted to take a look at some alternative funding models that exist in other states. So one example we found is that in 2018, Seattle created the sweetened beverage tax, which imposes a 1 3/4 cent fee on beverages that they deem to be high in sugar. And that is a tax that is levied on the distributors, not on the consumers. And they route that revenue entirely to programs that make healthy food accessible to Seattle residents and support childhood education. In 2021 alone, that brought in $20.3 million, and they used 61% of that towards food access programs, which included funding food bank programs. Then they used the remaining 39% towards child health and early learning programs. And then that program additionally not only funds food banks and food access programs, but also provides fresh, culturally relevant food to community centers and schools, and runs their Fresh Bucks program, which is a similar program to 3 Squares Vermont.
Thank you. In conclusion, and in a nutshell, since its inception in 2028, Vermonters Feeding Vermonters has collaborated with 499 farms, has purchased 104 crop pipes and improved food security and contributed an estimated of $3.8 million to Vermont's economy. So the program has delivered stable, guaranteed markets for local producers, which offers to consumers access affordable foods, and it's also boosted the economy in Vermont. So by keeping the Vermont food in the state. And despite these achievements, Vermont Feeding Vermonters currently struggles with funding, and the limited funding restricts the mini grants component and the larger purchases needed to increase community demands. Logistics and external factors such as extreme weather conditions further complicate supply chain and operations once the growing season concludes. Other states have implemented different programs as for example, Mainers Feeding Mainers, in which the state major food banks handles the operations, the administrative and logistics. Rhode Island Pound Fresh Bulk Harvest program, which allows producers to list its products for sale independently to at their own rates to other farms. And New Mexico's Regional Farm to Food Program, which designates one organization also, the Handle Vine, which is run solely by the USDA funding. So these programs operate through different funding models, but those reliant on USDA funds have had less certainty of permanence, which we're looking for more stable funding for Vermonters feeding Vermont. Other states, like the case of Seattle, they've like implemented another way of getting more funding, such as the switching the privilege tax, which aims to make healthy food accessible to the residents, supporting childhood education. So with the ongoing annual appropriations as outlined in the H167, additional funding would expand the streamlining process for participating farms and alleviate financial stress related to sourcing, distribution, and transportation costs for Vermonters, feeding Vermonters. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Questions, Representative Bosland?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Just one little update. The bill was actually presented in the Senate yesterday. So it's actually moving a tiny bit more than just having the first reading. They have started to take testimony about that. But I actually had a question for you, which was, you talked about challenges when there like weather adverse things happen and somebody's not able to meet the obligation in a contract. So what happens in that situation? You know, in a CSA, you buy in, and if you lose it, it's like, too bad, you don't get your produce. But we need the food for the food bank. So how does that work? If you have a contract and you lose your crop because of an early frost, does the farmer get to keep any of it? Does the food bank just start over? How does that work?
That's a good question. I don't know if we have like a full understanding of every situation. What we heard from Michelle is that contracts are fairly flexible. So for example, last year during the flooding, there was one farm that lost, I think it was their squash. I think they lost their tomato harvest, and then they were able to work with the food bank and instead supply like squash. And so the food bank works with farms, I think, individually to figure out like, you know, if they don't lose their entire crops. But that's a good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly flexible system in which if they're able to supply an equivalent amount of something else, then that can be accepted.
Yeah.
It's sort of built into the contract that there is the understanding of extenuating circumstances.
Correct.
Yeah.
Other questions, Representative O'Brien?
I wonder of the food the Vermont Food Bank distributes every year to Vermonters, you know, how much is coming from Vermont farms? Did you ever run into that?
Of the full Vermont Food Bank
Yeah.
distribution?
It's a good question. I think the Vermonters feeding Vermonters, if I remember, is like, at least in 2024, was maybe 2.3 million pounds of food. Yeah. It seems.
Out of, that was
I'm
the,
not aware of how much they distribute as an entire food bank, but.
We can follow up on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made a note of Representative O'Brien.
I can take a little bit on that. When I get food from the food bank for Vermont Food Bank for our food camp pantry at university, a lot of the produce comes from Canada. But for all the produce that we got from Vermont Food Bank and Vermont hunters, it all came from local farms.
Representative Lipsky?
Thank you. Two short questions. Do you know that 2.3 million that Seattle garnered from the sugary grain tax in 2021? Do you know what the population of Seattle is?
That's a great question. I don't
I
have
just
that,
looked it
and I
up, Jen.
should have written that down. I don't.
Okay, and
Obviously much.
do you know if that included Tacoma, which is a large neighboring town?
I don't. I'm sorry, but I can.
I mean, if we have 647,000 residents and they have
4 million, roughly.
4 million. But we discussed, Rep. Boslin proposed that option, and man, that's a lot of money. That would land. Second question, you mentioned funding cuts, and my question is that due to federal cuts?
Yes.
So-
They're all federal USD.
Because we were alarmed a month ago when that approximately 1.1 billion was cut. Our top priority in this committee was Vermonters feeding Vermonters, as led by the Vermont Food Bank. So it's very devastating. I'm sorry that you have to go through that experience this early in your life. But, so that answered both my questions. Thank you.
Let's take one more, Representative.
This is actually just a comment in terms of the sugary drink, because that actually was something we were talking about. And I actually was contacted by somebody from the American Heart Association who had done a study in Vermont last year. And they found that with our population, if we put in a 2 cents per ounce as opposed to 1.75, their estimate was that it would bring in $30 million a year. So, I mean, that was 2021, things have changed. But anyway, those were the numbers that were shared with me just like maybe within the last 2 weeks.
So, yeah.
That said, passing a sugary drink tax has been tried and it's complicated, but it's definitely something we're thinking about.
That's good to hear.
Good. Well, thank you again for that. We're going to take 5 minutes. We're on a tight schedule, so let's keep it to 5 minutes. And we'll move on to the next group then.
Thank you all so much for.
We are